When we decided to build the MassBio HQ and the MassBio Hub, we wanted to use local talent. We didn't know about AIS. When we found out about them, we wanted to source the furniture locally, and we did, and it was one of the best decisions that we ever made.
We're doing something different here.
What we're doing, again, is creating relationships.
It's really the people that make this organization special. It's the ability of our people to work hard, think differently, be creative.
When you walk through the space, you can definitely tell that we bleed Massachusetts.
When you say you manufacture in Massachusetts, they go, how do you do that? You go, Massachusetts has been great.
One of the most impressive things that I found from visiting and learning more about AIS is how diverse their workforce is.
I'll never forget when I went to tour the space, I was immediately impressed with the countries that were represented on the flags on the wall with the workforce. And to think that their manufacturing staff was comprised of over 50% women, it seemed like a perfect fit. Our board members and our members come in and can't believe how gorgeous everything is.
When MassBio chooses a strategic partner, they need to be best in class. They need to put out quality. They need to be committed to driving the economy. They need to be committed to diversity and inclusion. It has truly been an amazing experience.
Excellent. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Courtney Carrasco. I am the VP of Sales for AIS. AIS is a $220 million contract furniture manufacturer located right here in Leominster, Massachusetts. We are also part of MassBio's Premier Partner Program and the preferred furniture vendor for MassBio and the new MassBio Hub, along with Greg Lewis and his team. I'm joined today by a very talented panel of people from the real estate industry. As the world opens up, we as leaders are faced with the challenges of how organizations will return to work. We struggle with what's right, what is wrong, how to best manage and retain our existing workforce, ensuring everyone feels safe, all the while making certain our business is able to successfully operate in the new norm. The format of this program will be about 30 minutes of questions asked of the panel, and then we'll open it up to you as the audience. So let's get started. As we make the introductions, each panelist will introduce themselves and give us their perspective on how they're seeing the return to work through their lens. We'll then dive deeper into some additional questions. And with that said, our first panelist is Greg Lewis. Greg is a principal at Cressa Partners. So Greg, if you could please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your company, and give us some insight into what you're seeing as we return to work.
Of course, thanks, Courtney. And maybe just very quickly, thanks to MassBio for hosting us all, and definitely thanks to MassBio for all they've done during this COVID effort. They jumped right into the beginning of it and showed us all how to be good leaders. So a little bit about me. I've been in the industry for about 25 years now. The first 17 were inside pharmaceutical companies. The last 8 have been on the service side, supporting pharmaceutical companies. I'm at Cressa. Cressa is a real estate advisory firm, unique in the sense that we only represent tenants in the marketplace, not developers and not buildings. We have a presence all over the globe. And a heavy focus here within life sciences in the Boston market. So my sort of lens, I guess, on the return to work is it's happening. Obviously, it's happening already. I think many of you have probably been coming in and seeing the traffic increasing. So that's a telltale sign that things are returning to normal. Every company that we talk to really has a similar, at the core of sort of how they're making decisions is it all comes back to culture. There were a lot of different leaders in the beginning relative to cost and employee benefits, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what we're hearing a lot about is the impact of culture, whichever way you choose. So I think we'll continue to hear a lot more about that, but people are coming back. That's for sure. So that's my lens on it, and I'll toss it over to Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. That's actually a great segue into my lens. But first, so Michelle Yak, Director of Design with OTJ Architects here in Boston. Becky and I are colleagues. We helped start the Boston branch of OTJ a little over a year ago, but we've been working in the Boston market for 15, 20 years. I personally have been in the life science market for about 5 or 6. Becky will talk about herself in a little bit. But looking at the return to work from my lens, I have to say, my job is I'm a designer of space. And what has been interesting is that my conversations actually don't revolve around space all that much anymore. I'm happy to talk to any and all of you about space and how space could change or not change. But really, my conversations are now about business strategy and about hiring strategies, operational conversations about operational methods, really working with every company, trying to figure out how to maneuver through creating the culture that Greg was talking about, whether it's a culture folks had before the pandemic or a culture folks are trying to create. But creating a culture, primarily maybe an in-person culture, even though a lot of employees want to work remotely. So interestingly, we're kind of working through these types of business-related issues first, before getting into space. Again, happy to go into any more detail, but I'll pass it off to Becky, my partner in crime over here. Thanks, Bex.
Michelle. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for spending the time with us today. My name is Becky Boyer. I am the Director of Life Sciences at OTJ Architects. I, like Michelle, am a designer, but I've been doing, in the 20 years that I've been working in this field, about the last 12 to 14 have been primarily in life science and tech. And for my lens, it's really partnering with Michelle, and because she's so focused on the culture side in the office and I am so focused on the technical lab side, I'd say that the lab really hasn't changed much in this time. It's really more, I'd say, a psychology experiment, if you will, because I think people are not necessarily the same that they were before the pandemic now as employees. And so, like Michelle, the technical lab planning, there's certain business drivers that are there that, we need that planned in that space. But, I think it's more to Michelle's point, the business strategy, the culture, and working with her and how we can mesh those two sides together.
Excellent. Well, thanks, everyone. So I think we could all agree that culture is certainly the X factor to the success of a business. And it is going to be very interesting to see how businesses do adjust as everybody does start to return to work. So hopefully we can add some more insight as we continue our discussion. So what I'm going to do now is ask a couple of questions of our panelists. And we do have each individual will get a question, and then we have kind of an open panel discussion. And then after that, we will end up opening it up to the audience. So thanks again. With that said, I'm going to start off with Greg. So Greg, what role do you see COVID playing in client decisions as it pertains directly to real estate and more, I guess, the space and kind of planning?
Sure. So maybe if we rewind back to that sort of infamous Friday in March, a year plus ago, the sort of the immediate time after that, I think everybody had this sense of, once the sort of shock subsided a little bit, we can work from home. We seem to be being rather productive at it. Companies, were jumping in pretty quick and learning and adapting to the model, if you will. So the discussions back then were really about, do we need this office space? Do we need to pay, these rents that we're seeing in the marketplace? We could help our bottom line by downsizing a little bit, and some of these folks can work from home. And there was a significant emphasis on that discussion. which I'd say, as it kind of got into the summertime, it started to be curtailed a little bit, and started to talk about employee benefits. And then, as people started, looking at the opportunity to come back and the vaccine started coming in, there was much more of a shift towards how are we going to work in the office, and it sort of moved away from maybe we should talk about downsizing, and the conversation really moved away from cost and shifted more towards culture. So, I think COVID will continue to play a role in decision making, for the foreseeable future, and potentially, well into the future. Is how we plan space. Talking with some of the smaller firms, or even up into the large pharmas, it's how our workspace is. It's not necessarily if we're coming back. I think the general consensus is that the lion's share of people will come back. There's definitely a discussion about the work-life balance, the benefits. Some people definitely want to stay working from home, some don't. But as far as the workspace itself, I think that's where there'll be continued flexibility. And I'm sure Michelle will jump in on this topic at some point. But there's been, I would say, more of a tolerance versus an acceptance of remote working in this industry. Certainly there are companies that have had policies, or more, I guess it's been in the fabric of their DNA, virtual companies in life sciences. But for the most part, people have been in the office, which certainly facilitates the crux of space in Cambridge, and the space grabs, if you will, over time. So, and speaking of those space grabs, that's not changing. We're seeing spaces come on the market and spaces are gone. There is a bolus of life science space coming out of many different developers across the Cambridge and Boston markets and out in the suburbs. So, it continues to be a hot market, and people are looking at expanding. And the whole discussion of divesting or shrinking really has gone by the wayside. So I think, we're not going to get away from sort of how, I don't think the market in Cambridge has changed at all relative to COVID. That's just sort of through my lens. There will be companies that have more of a hybrid. Maybe that term's a little overused at this point, but I think that's really what we're going to see. But I don't think it moves the needle too much on the size of spaces that folks are taking. I think the emphasis will be more on the workplace and workspace strategy and the employee experience within the space, and how they move within the space. With a sort of post-COVID, not that that's really a term, I guess, but the return to work and how we move within our space now that we're back.
So, Greg, thanks so much for that. So you mentioned certainly flexibility is definitely the name of the game, right? You did mention, companies, certainly you don't see them divesting in their real footprint, right? But do you see companies investing, meaning taking more space to allow for more flexibility in the workspace, to give people more, and some of this may be an answer for Michelle as well, but just giving people more space to work, more options to work.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think I missed that topic. There was a discussion about taking more space to allow people to have social distancing at periods of time. That conversation petered out pretty quickly, because there really wasn't space to take. Mm-hmm. Certainly within the life science clusters, or adjacent space to folks. So I think companies that have been on those trajectories will continue on those trajectories. Obviously, there's some that won't, but by and large, I believe that the folks that have been on those trajectories are staying on them. With some variations of, maybe a little bit of reduced office space if there's a couple of particular groups that can truly be remote, or maybe have been in the past, and they're just getting rid of those groups' offices that they've had, because there certainly are some groups within organizations like that, but that goes back to the culture.
Sure. Excellent. Well, my next question is for Becky, and I know during your intro, Becky, you mentioned that, you're not seeing a ton of changes in terms of lab space design. You mentioned there's various business drivers that would influence the design of a lab space, but have you seen, speaking more about the culture, have you seen people having the flexibility in lab workers getting the flexibility to take hybrid roles and things like that?
Yeah, so I think really, I think a lot of people, especially in the lab, were always still in the lab in the middle of the pandemic because those experiments need to continue. And I think what has really changed is how people have operated within those labs themselves. So have they social distanced their equipment? Have they assigned a row or aisle of benches to a certain scientist or maybe a couple? I mean, depending on what your organization is like and how they were organized from the beginning, maybe there was not a lot of people in the lab at once to begin with. So, we know we have higher air changes in the lab than the office. We've got PPE protections. So there is a bit of a different ecosystem there than what you might see in an office. You have a lot more people at once. You have less air changes. You've got more fresh air in the lab. So I think it's really been a practice of how they've organized themselves. Have they decided to schedule in shifts? Have they put off experiments? And so it's more an organizational psychology type like approach than truly a different way that we're designing the lab. We're still need the utilities. We've always been looking at flexibility in the lab just so that you can change your environment over time. But, I see that probably is going to just go, either people are going to continue to work like that because it is working well for them, or we're, going to kind of go back to having, more of a regularized work life as people get more vaccinated or, COVID just starts to decrease because of that in general. So I'd really say standard operating procedures is the way it's been dealt with more in the lab.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you for that. The next question I'll direct to Michelle. So Michelle, what have you seen change with design since the pandemic and as we kind of come out of the pandemic?
So yeah, thanks, Courtney. So as anticlimactic as this sounds, I kind of agree with Becky and Greg that there really hasn't been a lot that has changed, at least with respect to design and space design. We had all these topics, hot buzzwords, trends that we saw before COVID. We knew, especially in the life science world, companies were trying to deal with rapid growth. Often a lot of companies aren't even able to predict what that growth is because it's so rapid, it's so fast paced. We talked, the real estate costs in Cambridge were booming long before this. And so other topics of that kind of came about of assigned desk, unassigned desks. Do we do agile working? Can some of these buzzwords or different ways of working kind of help alleviate or offset the high real estate costs? Wellness was always a hot topic. All of those were before COVID. And I want to say now, COVID really has just taken those topics that maybe used to be theoretical for companies, ideas that companies were throwing around, and kind of forcing them to say, now you have to make this decision. Now we're here and we have to decide what is the flexibility policy? Is there a flexibility policy? And again, it goes back to more of the business side and how you run, as opposed to something about the space or design of the space that has really changed drastically. It really hasn't. If that's fair to say, I guess.
I mean, I could really kind of echo what you're saying in terms of the products that we're manufacturing. I mean, with the exception of screens and panels, and, the business leaders have allowed for hybrid workspaces, but our product development really has not changed. our product portfolio is designed to fill the floor, and we can create flexible spaces and those hoteling spaces, touchdown spaces, things like that. So I would tend to agree with you.
Yeah.
As much as I think people thought that COVID changed the working environment drastically. So.
And to Greg's point too, we thought maybe we would gain more space or get more space because of social distancing. But going back to what was happening before COVID in the life science world, there's so much growth happening and the companies are doing so well, which is fantastic. But we have to accommodate all these new people coming in. So it's really not a matter of we can blanket say, let's cut our real estate in half. We don't need it anymore. That's really not the case. We have to fit in more people and then make it work well to each company's culture. Just what everyone keeps saying. Yeah.
Culture is, I'm a firm believer, it's the X factor to a business's success. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to the panel, and whoever wants to take this question, as the whole world's changed and it made us certainly look at things much, much differently than we had in the past. But I'm really curious, and I think the audience would be curious as to how your conversations with customers have pivoted over the past year. And any one of you guys can certainly take the question.
Yeah, happy to jump in on that. Obviously, there's been an evolution of conversations, since the beginning. I think, kind of where we are now, one client kind of comes to mind. They've actually had some pretty decent headcount growth over the past year. And they are returning to work with not enough seats. So they really can't have everybody come back to the office because some people have never been in the office to even have a seat. So it immediately creates a discussion on, what do we do? And do we need more? Do we, call Michelle and have her redesign our space for us and fit more people in here, and compression, as we used to call it. That term may be gone by the wayside at this point. But that's it. That was an interesting conversation with the client because what do you do? And there's a number of different opportunities there. I think the net result is a hybrid again of some of those people may remain remote, some will be in the office certain times. So what is their space going to look like? So our conversations, I would say, have geared, although there's still some sort of straight real estate advisory discussions, it tends to be more in the numbers game, and how do we work with what we have, and what does that look like financially? How do we change what we have, and what does that look like financially? Or what else can we take to get us to a point where we can have a seat for the people that we need seats for? And as a result of that, is it moving wholesale? So there's companies that may have quite a bit of term left on some of their leases that may be looking at moving because there's no expansion opportunities where they are. And their growth is actually, in this particular case, has exceeded what they had planned on. So, but as far as how they pivoted, it really is about more analytics, I think, versus just companies saying, "Hey, we need some more space," or companies, looking at their neighbors are moving out and they're just going to space grab that space. It really is, some detailed analytics and what we would call here at Crescent decision support. So we will help, build different models to help drive those decisions. Interestingly enough, most of them come back to culture at this point, as we've kind of talked about a number of times, but heavy focus on the analytics up front for sure.
Do you find, and this is more of an open question for the panel, do you guys find more business leaders polling their employees as to what's most important to them as they return to work? Because people have been at home, they've been having to have their children at home because of lack of daycare and other extenuating circumstances. Do you feel that companies are taking into account the needs and wants of employees now more so than they did in the past.
Go ahead, Becky, go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. And I think, I think for some businesses, it's a bit of a different approach to start thinking about or talking to people about how they're feeling about coming back. And, I think it's going to be a continued evolution as well. Like it's not a, bullseye, one solution fits all. And it's not like things aren't going to continue to evolve and change. And I think it's, us listening to our customers and understanding what they need and helping them with solutions that can help them change over time as well.
Yeah, if I could jump in, Courtney, and just say everybody's reaching out and polling to their entire staff, which is great. And they're collecting all this data, but we're also all in this same boat where now we have the data and what do we do with it? And it's very interesting that, universally, we know there are some people who like the flexibility and the working from home, and universally there are people who want to be back full time. And then there's always the mix. But what do we do with that? And I guess I just want to say to everyone that we're all figuring it out together. And these are hard decisions that everyone's kind of being forced to make. So not that it's helpful, but again, we're all kind of doing this together. I haven't come across anyone who has created the end all be all ultimate solution on how to analyze this data and then implement it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think, there's the term policy. I think, there were in the past, 5, 6, 7 years, there's been sort of where I've been polled on, do we have remote working policies? Do we have, any sort of guidance around that? Well, there really wasn't. It was more if a manager, knew a person could do work from home and trusted them, they would kind of let them work from home, and the upper management may not even know. So there's a lot of that sort of organic remote working happening. But really, sans policy, there weren't. I mean, don't get me wrong, some companies obviously had them, but on the whole, it was really just something that naturally happened. So I think what's being forced now is every level of the organization in the leadership levels are forced to look at this and actually provide an opinion on it, and thoughts on it, and without question, there'll be some divide in some cases, and I definitely can acknowledge some of the leaders that we work with have done a stellar job at reaching out to their clients, back to the question, Courtney, and talking to their team members about what are the important things, the benefits, the parking, the commuting hours, like all of those types of discussions have really been on the forefront. And so I think, and that, that's the industry, the people care about, their colleagues and their teammates. And, but in the end, I think we will probably see some more, text and policies, if you will, or guidelines, probably a better term, around the remote working or hybrid. And I think that really is needed to a certain degree relative to real estate. Knowing what you're going to have in the building or how many people you're going to have in the building on a given day can help drive decisions, some which could be, pretty big expenditures. And it also just, helps with the culture. It helps to understand the makeup of people that are going to be in the building on particular days. So again, like Becky said, there's not a one size fits all solution for this. But I think that what we'll see is there will be alignment across organizations, because people are having the dialogue, which is a great thing.
I would tend to agree. I think in my opinion, I've seen so many more discussions happening around culture and employee retention. Those were always hot topics before, but I think companies are actually making a concerted effort to make those two topics primary as we get back to work.
Great.
All right. Well, I'm going to open it up to our attendees to ask some questions through utilizing the chat function. We do have one question that already came in. So these will be open panel, whoever wants to take the question kind of concept. So what is the most innovative concept you've seen with new office space designs?
Want me to jump in? Okay. Again, it hasn't been about a product or space. I think the most innovative are the ones I have seen are the companies that are just kind of willing to try something new. It's a very different way of working, especially in the life science industry. And so I would say the folks who are willing to just try something new, maybe even for a pilot period, let's just try this for 3 months, see if it works, and then reassess. I have to say, I feel like that's been the innovation that I have seen. Anyone else you definitely can disagree with that statement if you guys want to jump in and disagree about it. But I would say that's where I see the innovation.
I agree. I think too, technology is going to help support some of these questions that Greg was talking about as far as space of, do we have a system where people sign in and reserve a desk, and that's a first come, first serve on a rolling basis of we're allowing 30% of our employees back now. Maybe it'll be 60% in 6 months, whatever that program is that they've decided, or guidelines, like Greg was saying, that they've decided. How can technology help support some of this? Even, I know there's a lot of mechanical implementations these days of trying to put UV light or air cleansingness in the mechanical systems, but that can be a really big expense. But maybe it's something as simple as that scheduling type of software, just so that you have an idea of your true headcount in the office at that time.
Yeah, and I feel badly because I never talk about space. So to make sure we actually do talk about space, I would say using these platforms and really understanding who's in the space and when, as Greg and Becky have both said. We are, of course, trying to make the space work harder than it ever has in the past. That was a topic we talked about before COVID. And again, it's now just accentuated. Is an office space that is mostly vacant? Is that really the appropriate use of real estate? Can we double function or triple function it so that it can form as a huddle room while that person who is dedicated to that space is traveling or away in meetings all day? How can we make the space multi-purpose and work harder and not sit empty? Same thing for big spaces like the cafeteria. Really, we don't have the luxury of letting spaces sit vacant for most of the day. And Greg, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not please. I was just going to echo what Becky had said. The room reservations, software, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of innovation. And furthermore, data will be collected from those over time. So let's just say 6 months of this, right? We have some reservation software, we have data over 6 months. I think that sort of becomes the point, and maybe it's 3 months or 6 months or a year, where then you can really get innovative with your space and how you might change it or adapt it once you have that data and you have some indices to work from to drive some decisions, and out of that can come some pretty innovative solutions. To Michelle's point, maybe it's, we make a bigger cafeteria because 20% of the desks aren't even being used, but we see people sitting in the cafeteria all the time. So let's create more of that buzz, more of that coffee shop style office space. So I think they really go hand in hand. And I really believe that over the course of the next year or so, that's when we'll start to see some new trends and some innovation happening. From a thought perspective, the implementation of bricks and mortar of that may come a little bit later. But a year's not that far away. I mean, they're pretty short. So on the business cycle.
You touched on it, Courtney, a little when you mentioned daycare, and I know we've talked about it a little in our group, but I don't know that companies have gotten there yet, but to layer in that piece of flexibility, would it be beneficial and innovative for companies to create a daycare on site that would allow people to be able to more easily come into work, know that their children are being well taken care of, and then can leave and go home with them? You know, you reduce the pickup times and drop offs and all of that. And, you know, like I said, we haven't, Michelle, I don't know if you've heard any, I haven't heard anybody explicitly say that would be something interesting, but I think, again, to Greg's point of that, and Courtney with, you know, talking about the surveys, like, how can we incorporate some more of those spaces, the shop type space or the daycare type space, to help support employees needing, you know, that in their day-to-day work life?
I would agree. I mean, I think all this gets back to the question that Michelle was asked, is how has design of a space changed? And again, everyone is echoing, it really hasn't. You know, there's going to be consistent innovative things that we can do to make our space, like Michelle said, work harder, right? Whether it's implementing technology or putting an on-site daycare or things of that nature. But you know, at the end of the day, the reality is that the design and the need for flexibility, collaboration, multi-purpose, you know, uses within the space are, you know, that's still happening. Those are still hot topics as we move through this. So another question. So I know we talked about this on our group when we were discussing the whole return to work, but has the pandemic forced companies to think about real estate outside of Boston and Cambridge?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you could say it's the pandemic. You could say it's the lack of vacancy, you know, in Cambridge. That trend has certainly been happening over years. There was, without a doubt, discussion about that, you know, with a number of our clients, and I'm sure many folks, of if we take people and put them out in, you know, in the suburban or urban areas, you know, there's less contact, there's less people, we can get, you know, some better real estate, you know, rents. So I don't think the pandemic necessarily caused it, but it certainly sort of exacerbated the you know, investigation of it. And there are plenty of wonderful options out there, you know, in the suburban market. You know, obviously there's plenty in the urban market. But yeah, you know, it's definitely, you know, I think when you get back to sort of the work-life balance benefits to employees, that's when it can become more of a topic of discussion. You know, if your demographics are more North Shore, sort of Central Mass Pike, then maybe you're looking out, you know, Bedford-ish versus Cambridge, something like that. There's definitely a value to that for people from a commuting perspective. You know, finding a company that has everybody from one side of the city is the problematic part. You're never going to get a perfect demographic to find a building. But you know, I think the suburbs are great opportunities regardless of the pandemic.
So to kind of piggyback off that, we have another question, Greg, directed to you. What do you see in terms of real estate prices, and as far as office/lab space in Cambridge or Boston? Do you see them dropping or increasing, or say kind of staying the same due to people working more remote?
As it relates to life science space, I don't see them going down. You know, you could argue some, you know, office spaces that are more, you know, historic office spaces, you know, in high rises, et cetera, in Boston may not have the same, you know, clientele coming in, or there might be some downsizing going on. You know, that's not my area of expertise, but that's certainly the rumblings that I'm hearing. I'm sure many folks are. But specific to life sciences in this audience, I don't see those numbers going down. There's been no indication in any data that we've seen that that's happening. You know, in fact, there are increasing rents in some of the hot areas within Cambridge and down here where I am in the Seaport. So, yeah, I don't see those numbers going down. No.
Well, this is kind of the next question that we have is kind of tying back into culture, which in my opinion, I feel is this is kind of the scariest thing when we talk about working remote is the younger workforce, right? So what feedback or data do we have relative to the younger workforce and their preferences? And are those preferences driving change as companies look to retain and attain new talent?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Anyone else, please jump in as well if I'm lingering too long. But yeah, I have to say, again, going back to what we've been saying a lot is COVID really isn't the cause or the culprit for all of these changes. These are all topics that were pre-COVID. And before it might have been millennials or any other ways of looking at different workforces. But yes, there's a lot of data coming in that people want this flexibility. And I will say, one of those topics we talked about before COVID was this agile, unassigned, assigned working, and can that help with your real estate footprint? And something that I found quite interesting over the past year that we've been taking in all of these surveys is before COVID, when companies were approaching the subject of unassigned seating, flexible working, again, to help lower their real estate footprint, everyone was up in arms, and a lot of scientists or maybe folks in the tech world who are coding, there was a lot of pushback saying, I need my dedicated space, I need my dedicated space. But what I found super interesting over the last year is that, yes, that is still very prevalent with a good majority of these companies. But actually, every single company that I have worked with over the past few years does have a decent population of people who are wanting to be more agile and wanting to be more flexible. Is it based on demographic and being in the younger generation? Possibly kind of relating to that millennial topic. But absolutely, I would say there is a push towards wanting to be more flexible. And believe it or not, even though it seems like the majority of the workforce wants that traditional, dedicated, quiet space, there really is a good amount of people who will come in, to Greg's point, and sit in the cafeteria and be happy working that way, especially if that person can run home and do really hard data input or data analysis on their computer at home, but then come into the office for these social activities, working inside of a lab, collaboration, any and all of that. Anyone else want to jump in on that? I think so I don't talk in circles on it, but answer your question, Courtney?
Yeah, absolutely. And so actually the next question kind of ties into this, specifically though, relating to the scientific environment in which the majority of our audience is working, right? So how do you see the option for hoteling for scientific staff that need to be directly tied to the lab? I mean, there's one discussion of people having just to sit down and enter a bunch of data into a computer, but when you have an office space and then you have a lab space, and oftentimes they need to collaborate and communicate. How do you feel like this whole hoteling concept would work? And Becky, maybe that's a question for you as well.
Yeah. I think there are some companies that when they're looking at, the lab people are never not in the office. All the office people might not be in the lab, but those lab associates do need somewhere to go. So I think, we've seen a couple companies where that becomes the primary focus. And so if space is an issue or, something along those lines, then they're saying the lab people are going to be the one that have the majority of those desks or hoteling stations. And then we'll figure out how we deal with the HR or the finance or other supporting employees, because they may not need to be, to Michelle's point about coming in for collaboration or meetings, they may not need to be in the office, and it's a better job suited for remote working, but it becomes more of a priority for those lab associates to have that space. I don't think we've seen much hoteling per se, Michelle, in that regard. They've had a dedicated seat, but when you start to think about the agile working, how does that play? But I think lab associates are taking the priority, I guess, in really needing them to have that adjacent space.
Yeah, I agree with that. The over the years, and I think back to 25 years ago when I started in this industry, lab people really didn't have a space outside the office much, and now it's, because of technology, specifically automation, they do because they can set things up and they can do, writing outside. So, that said, the write-up space, I think one thing that I've been hearing is neighborhoods. So you'll have neighborhoods so they will be sort of unassigned, agile, but there'll be neighborhoods, this particular lab has this, area. So, generally where you're going to go to seek out a colleague, from the lab. So maybe one way to sort of blend those two aspects.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll jump in again too. I think similar to the neighborhoods, or we've talked about hybrid or flexible working. I would say the same thing for the actual space design is a mix, a hybrid, a mix of assigned and unassigned. A few years ago, when we were really starting to push more for agile working to reduce the real estate, it was almost as if when you said you needed a permanent desk, it was almost as if you were a bad person because of it, because you need a desk, you need an office, you need a private space, you need to focus. And it was almost as if we were celebrating the folks who want to be agile because it helps the footprint. And now what it seems that we're finding is it's perfectly okay if you need a permanent desk, but believe it or not, there's plenty of people or other people who don't need a permanent desk. So we can kind of create a mix of spaces, some dedicated, some not dedicated. And those are ways that we can make the space work harder for itself and still get in the head count that we need. And nobody's way of working is right or wrong, if I could throw that in there.
Agreed. The next question and kind of almost comment is, will there be more furniture options, such as lockers and solutions like that where people can take advantage of the hoteling? And I know from our perspective, we're quoting thousands of lockers for very large organizations with digital locks and RFID access and things like that to give employees a little bit more flexibility, especially as we become a proverbial paperless society, so we're told. Those needs for storage really kind of shrink, right? So the solutions are there, and we certainly are seeing them implemented a lot more.
Absolutely.
I think those two go hand in hand. If you have some agile seating, the locker.
And flexible furniture solutions as well, not just the storage, but desks that are movable or other flexible solutions.
Culture and flexibility seem to be the two buzzwords in our topic of discussion today. We kind of touched on this last question we do have, but thoughts on how the experience of last year has affected work-life balance. This is a big one. So anybody can take it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier on, I don't think people are the same people they were a year ago. And so I think in some cases for that individual, it's trying to figure out what that means. And then you have your organization, as an employee supporting that and what does that mean? Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, Becky, you always, I don't want to steal your line here, but you always talk about how you talk about feelings.
You talk a lot about
you used to talk about equipment, but now you talk about feeling. I love talking about feelings, but Becky.
So I think one thing that we do, we can get still connected with people, even though it's virtual, by ways of, we now know their dogs and their cats and their kids. And, maybe, their boy screams a little louder when he wants a snack than their girl or something. So, in those, I think we can all probably chuckle. We've had some of those, I certainly have. But those little things are things that kind of make you connected and with the people, your colleagues that you don't see every day, but you are in their house virtually, and so you do the best you can with it. And it is it's a total shift and mind change. But I think we've all collectively, and we should all pat ourselves on the back for what we've all accomplished. Everybody on this call and around the world. It's been tough.
I would tend to agree. One question I have, and I don't know if you guys are seeing it, but gyms and people being mindful of their physical and mental and health well-being. You feel that that's become more important in people's lives over the past year?
It's definitely been asked of in a lot more projects to incorporate that into the space. We have a couple of projects right now that have them.
Yeah, I guess I would say though similarly that is one of those topics that has been gaining momentum pre-COVID. So maybe COVID accelerated it a little bit and accelerated the flexibility, the work-life balance. But again, it's been a hot topic that's been gaining momentum for a long time. So is it from COVID? Is it not?
It's kind of hard to tell. Yeah, I would agree. That we're definitely seeing spaces that are incorporating gyms and daycares and things like that are important to employees, but that's been going on, and I just didn't know if we were seeing it more frequently, just simply due to COVID. But interesting perspective. With that said, if there are no other questions or comments by our panel, we can go ahead and wrap it up, but I'll wait a few seconds to see if the panel or if the audience has any additional questions. I don't see anything coming up in the chat yet. Okay, no questions. All right. Well, thank you everybody on this great panel for participating. Thank you to MassBio for everything you've done, not only with this event, but during COVID. We greatly appreciate it. We appreciate the audience's participation. Please join MassBio next week, June 23rd from at 11 a.m. as we continue the conversation about creating a new workplace roadmap.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much.
Everyone.
Okay.
Talk to you guys.